A slash of red asked over the bronze basin as Moran pressed his palm to the rim. The occult researcher moved 2 steps back and held his breath while the dark liquid beaded on the metal and pulled toward the disc at the center. Suspicion sharpened his hands. He kept his fingers wrapped around the leather strap of his satchel and counted the breaths between statements. The basin thrummed under the candlelight, and the question that had driven him into the cave, whether blood was law here, hung like iron on his tongue. He had come for fragments, pottery shards, a mention in a ledger, a passing note in a merchant's list. Instead, the opening act of the clan as night was a living, public contract. The occult researcher watched the 4 warriors lean in, watched Karu set his jaw and listen for the reactions of younger men. The central problem was immediate and visible. The clan used the wounded body's blood to bind people to obligations, and this binding appeared to exert a physical force. The researcher would have to decide, in that hall and under those eyes, whether to record, to intervene, or to accept a different role entirely. He kept his voice low. "Who cut him?" the researcher asked. His baritone came measured, the wire rim glasses catching a candle flare. Karu answered without surprise, "Myran did this. He offered himself to the law tonight." The exchange was short. The researcher felt the first shift, suspicion narrowing into clinical curiosity. He stepped closer, fingers grazing the spine of his grimoire as if counting pages could steady him. A scribe moved in the stair alcove and lit a peg lamp. Isla nosed the lamp toward the basin and frowned. Her hands smelled of ink and resin. She kept her shoulders rolled as if cold. "You should not be here," she said in a flat tone. "You are not one of us." The researcher's reply was a question, practiced and precise. "And who decides that?" Ayla's eyes darted to Karu, then back. Karu's lips thinned. "We do," he said. "We have always decided." The researcher recorded gestures and names as though they were artifacts. He noted that Myran's cut was shallow where it mattered, the tendon spared, the blood angled toward the bowl. He noted the braided cords stacked beside the basin, the same cordwork he had seen in a damaged mural sketch from a provincial archive. Evidence altered suspicion into a working hypothesis. The clan's rituals linked flesh to obligation, and they had material implements that made the claim enforceable. He lifted his chin and asked for access to the storeroom where old rites were kept. Karu paused and named conditions. "You will not speak of what you saw, and you will help translate texts." The offer was a trap folded into a bargain. The researcher's second emotion shift moved from curiosity into calculation. He felt the pull of complicity and counted costs. He swallowed once and accepted Karu's terms with a nod. Isla stepped forward and led him down the narrow stair where the stone breathed cold against their calves. In the storage niche, debris fell away under Isla's practical hands. She did not hesitate. She cleared a shelf with exact movements, revealing a half-buried disc carved from pale metal. The researcher touched the edge and felt a coolness that belonged to deep earth. Braided cords lay atop the disc. When Myran brushed a thumb along the sigil, a faint metallic glow threaded the groove. It was not heat but a thin, internal reflection that the researcher could not reduce to smoke or polish. This was hidden for a reason," Ayla answered. "We hide what keeps the house whole." Her voice held neither apology nor pride. The researcher read the sigil with practiced eyes, and then with the translator's patience he had learned from dusty ledgers. As he spoke translations aloud, Isla corrected terms with short, clipped lines, the Watchers of the Hollow. He read, "Lineage made by wound, lineage made by wound." Isla repeated softer. The exchange was precise and mechanical, the ritual language converted into contractual clauses in the researcher's mind. He felt the third emotion shift begin, curiosity bending into unease, when he realized the terms named not just devotion but legal status. Karu gathered men around a low brazier. Steam was kept low, the smoke forced into a vent by practiced hands. He a foundation story in a voice that broke only when speaking of the clan's dead. "Long ago the Watchers left marks on bone," he said. Our kin bound themselves so the watchers would stand guard. The oath is the law of names, the researcher pressed for evidence. Names enforced how? By fear or by force? Karu looked at the basin, then at Moran, both by the law's demand and the watcher's keeping. The researcher asked for a witness to the enforcement, and Moran obliged with a hard laugh. Come, Moran, see what the watchers do when the law is tested. They moved through a curtain, and a soldier led the scholar to a sealed niche. The light in the niche was slabbed and thin. It took the researcher 3 breaths to notice the smell: old bone, resin, and a copper tang. The bound skeleton slumped in the niche had cords threaded through cracked bone. The braid had been tightened and left to petrify into black leather. The discovery overrode the researcher's remaining dispassion. His hands went cold. He muttered, "This is recent." Karu tilted his head. "It was a punishment," he said. "For those who broke the oath." ILS pen stopped. The next moments were terse. A confrontation formed, words sharpened, and the hall responded to tension. "You law," the researcher said. "You lineage. This is murder dressed as ritual." Karu's mouth compressed. "You came without right, and you call our right murder." He snapped. Maran stepped forward and caught Karu's eye as if asking permission. The arguing lines were short and rapid. "Dunty, leave." Maran barked, "This man is a guest." Karu returned, "He is not a guest to us." The researcher's voice cut in, "You hide bones and call them law." 3 to 6 rapid exchanges followed, voices low and sharp. The researcher demanded access to the basin records. Karu refused. Isla interposed herself between them and said, "You will serve us or you will leave with nothing." The researcher understood that the offer meant 2 things: silence enforced through violence, and an invitation to be part of the ritual economy. He was no longer a neutral observer. The scholars in him measured outcomes and risk. He weighed leaving with notes insufficient to prove what he had seen against staying and gaining closer access. He also watched the men around him, how they flinched when Karu spoke, how Moran tried a grin that never reached his eyes. The researcher's 4th emotional shift was a move toward darkened resolve. He decided to remain and accept a service position, translating, cataloging, and thus staying within the clan's sight. For days he worked under the low brazier and scribal lamp. He copied glyphs, catalogued chord patterns, and watched the clan perform small bindings for births and deaths. He wrote entries that recorded measures, not moral judgments. When a young woman claimed a debt and presented braided cord as evidence, men read out the oaths and tied thin strands of her hair into a knot. The researcher wrote, "One strand, one debt." These were not abstractities. The physical actions, hands tying, knots tightening, skin marked, made obligations visible and immediate. An external event arrived on the 3rd night. A messenger burst into the hall, breathless and bleeding. "They took the north road," he gasped. "A farmer refused, and he broke off," and Karu rose with a hard sound. The room reorganized around the new urgency. The researcher followed Karu out and watched a corporal roll open a leather sack to reveal a scorched tally list. Names crossed out and braided cords cut. Someone had broken bonds and forced the clan to answer. The researcher's unease grew into alarm. This was not mere local maintenance, but contested power. That night the clan called for a public demonstration. Men lined the basin, and the air felt like the damp of a closed cave. Karu's voice carried the same practiced cadence he used when narrating foundation myths. "We will show the law is not empty," he said. Moran stepped forward again. "You will see the watchers," he told the researcher, "and you will record what you see." The researcher nodded, and his hand shook enough that he had to set his pen down. The binding began with Moran slicing his forearm over the basin. The cut was clean and shallow. Blood beaded, fell and darkened the basin's inner curve. The braided cords were held above the liquid, and then, as if responding, thin filaments of the blood rose in a faint, viscous thread and reached toward the carved disc. The room exhaled a noise like a collective intake of breath. The researcher saw physical phenomena he could not explain. The threads pulled taut, a shimmer along the discus grooves, and a sudden tension in the warrior's shoulders. The demonstration was undeniable. The climax arrived in a single, crushing moment. An elder stepped forward and recited a phrase that the researcher had been translating for days. As the elder spoke, the cords tightened and Miran staggered as if jerked by an unseen hand. Isla cried out, and Karu's face went white for the first time in the chapter. Men reached for knives and for ropes, not because they expected immediate violence, but because the oath had just shown itself to act across bodies. The researcher's notebook slid from his lap and hit the stone with a sound that broke the rhythm of the hall. He felt fear fully then. The academic curiosity that had brought him to a file had been replaced by the realization that the object of study moved its own parts. After the ritual, the clan sealed the hall. Men resumed tasks as if they had performed an ordinary duty. Moran wrapped his arm with cloth and laughed at a private joke. Karu returned to his chair and placed his palm atop the disc as one might place a hand on an active instrument. Isla walked the researcher to the stair and spoke in a tone that mixed something like warning and something like plea. "You have the shard," she said, pointing. The researcher had slipped a small fragment of the disc into his satchel during the commotion. He kept his voice steady. "I do," outside. The stair brought him into the grey pre-dawn. The passage spat him into cold air and a sky that still held the memory of night. He carried the shard in his hand and felt the weight of it in a way that was not only physical. He thought of the sealed niche and the corded skeleton. He thought of Karu's bargain and Isla's brief hesitation when she had told him he must serve the clan. The final paragraph closes on an action. The researcher turned his face toward the east, tightened the satchel strap, and walked away from the stair with the shard tucked beneath his coat and a decision to test the object in the light of daylight. Myron convulsed on the flagstones as the carved disc at the basin flared with a cold, inner gold and braided blood threads pulled taut toward it. Suspicion drove the researcher forward. He kept one hand on his satchel strap and the other on the leather spine of his grimoire, measuring distance and danger with equal care. The elders shoved Moran back, voices hard and short. "Hold him." Elder Saren barked, "Do not touch the disc." The researcher stepped in and demanded a name for the phenomenon. And the chamber answered with only heaving breath. He had seen blood meet bronze before. He remembered the slash of red arsing over the basin in the previous rite, when Moran first pressed his palm to the rim. That image sat in his pocket the way a tool sits in a craftsman's hand. Now the binding did something he had not catalogued. It behaved like an open wound. That thought, suspicion reshaping to alarm, moved his fingers to the grimoire and made him lean closer. "What is happening to him?" he asked. Talia held a lantern at his elbow. She kept her eyes on Moran and did not answer immediately. The chamber smelled of tallow and old dust. The ceiling lay low, every voice ricocheted. Elder Saran pulled a thin cloth from his belt and pressed it to Myran's brow. Younger elders circled with knives that were ceremonial but real. He named it, Saran, voice flat. "He the name we do not speak." A ripple of anger snapped through the ring. The researcher watched elder faces shift, some closed, some raw with fear. He recorded the names silently in his head. Myran, Saran, Kajem, Talia. He kept the list like a set of coordinates. Myran's breathing changed. At first it was a wet rattle, then a cadence that belonged to someone else. "Casa, Casa at the ceiling mound," he said in a cadence that tilted the room. Elder Kajem advanced, teeth clenched. "You made him speak the place." Kajem to Saran, "You invited a curse." Saran, as fingers tightened on the cloth. "Do not say that, Kajem. We do not call it." The argument snapped. Words hit like flint on stone. The researcher held the grimoire open with a cautious thumb and scanned his notes for any parallel. The suspicion deepened to dread when Moran, eyes unfocused, tried to stand and move toward a side corridor. "He wants the sealed tum." Talia, voice low. "He keeps saying he must break the pact." The researcher moved to intercept. Moran lurched into him and the two nearly fell. Hands grabbed Moran's shoulders, older hands that had bound many bodies, and pulled him back. Stop him, Kajum ordered, if he breaches the pact. The Watchers will not look kindly on us. The researcher pressed his palm to Moran's shoulder to steady him, and felt a tremor run through bone and sinew. They moved Moran away from the basin into an antechamber off the main hall. The lantern lights sputtered. The researcher worked without pause. He checked the old stitch around the sigil, brushed soot from the edges, and found fresh rasp marks on the disc's rim. Tampering, he said aloud. The tool marks are modern. Someone opened the seal recently. Talia crouched and pointed to soot in the hairline cracks. I found footprints by the outer wall 3 nights ago, she said. They stopped at the elder stair. Saren's jaw tightened. Who would dare? Kajum spat outsiders. Traitors, they argued while Moran lay trembling. The room's temperature felt to the researcher like a happening. The elders' voices rose in quick, clipped bars. Talia paced. Someone slammed a palm against a shelf. The researcher read the sigil anyway. He murmured aloud the lineages and wearer, notes he detranscribed, words that named neither god nor demon but a pattern of invocation. The disc did not close. Instead, the binding reacted. The braided blood on Myran's wrist pulsed like a living cord and tugged toward the disc. The binding is not a seal, he said. It is an injury. It bleeds outward when prodded. The words landed with weight. Elder Saren leaned forward. An injury. He said, you are a scholar, speak plain. The researcher lifted his glasses with one finger and set them back. If the binding opens like a wound, then the oath is conditional. It can be breached. It can be manipulated. Talia's mouth went narrow, so someone could use it against us, she said. Kajum slammed a fist on the table. Then they must pay. Blood purge. Now voices rose into a roar. Quick exchange. Kajum, Saren sharply. Not yet. Not without proof. Proof. Kajum snapped. Proof is blood. Proof is the disc itself. The researcher watched the debate. He could feel the room split along a seam. One group wanted a purge. Another wanted to seal and hide. He did not want to be the deciding voice, but his reading had tilted the options toward urgency and investigation. He closed the grimoire and looked at Maran, whose pulse hammered like a small drum beneath the cloth. Moran's voice shifted again. Not them, he said, and the chamber snagged on the phrase, find the half-disc. The marks were fresh. They used iron. They called across the seam. Talia's eyes widened. The half-disc, she asked. We keep the half-disc under the old burial stone beyond the lower vaults. No one touches it but the elders. Someone touched it, Moran insisted. Someone who knows the binding. Saren's mouth thinned. Bring light to the lower vaults. Now he barked the order and 2 younger elders snatched torches. They moved as a unit down the stone stair, through a narrow corridor where the ceiling lowered further and the air smelled of old incense and damp clay. The researcher kept his hand on the grimoire and his eyes on Moran's twitching fingers. He noted Talia's posture, knees bent, shoulders squared for sudden motion, and filed her stance as readiness. Do not go alone, he told Talia quietly. She turned her head and answered, I will not leave him. Her voice held a short, fierce steadiness. In the sealed side chamber beneath the clan hall, they found the carved disc half, buried under a crust of soot and mud. The outer face had unfamiliar tool marks, and the central glyph had a hairline fracture with recent soot embedded. The researcher crouched and ran a fingertip along the crack. It was warm. That small, precise physical detail collapsed argument into fact. He lifted a lantern and found brass filings on the floor, modern filings, not the copper dust of ancient smithing. They used an iron berin, he said. Not one of our rites. Talia brushed the dirt aside and uncovered a braided cord looped through a notch. The cord smelled of fresh smoke. Back above, the elder council fractured in force. Kajum called for immediate purge. Saren argued for repair. If we purge, we risk angering the Watchers when they find their seal violated. Saren, if we seal, we risk leaving a wound open to manipulation. The researcher put both palms flat on the table and articulated the options with short sentences. He did not ask for authority. He offered consequences. If we purge now, outsiders will see blood and assume punishment. They may retaliate. If we seal and hide the crack, the tampering remains and can be used again, Kajum paced. So what do you suggest, scholar? He asked. The researcher suggested a middle course. Secure the tome, look for signs of human entry, and interrogate those with access. We must treat the disc as evidence and as injury, he said. We cannot treat it as only law. The words landed into a silence long enough that breaths counted. Elder Saren met his gaze. You would mediate our law, he asked. The researcher showed no contempt. I would read the law's language and ask which parts are worn and which parts are used as weapons, the council muttered. Talia nodded once and tightened her grip on the lantern handle. They returned to the ritual alcove for a reading. The researcher opened the grimoire and traced a pattern he had copied from an old covenant ledger. He spoke the naming sequence beneath his breath while Talia held the light and the elders formed a ring. The disc replied by throwing a thin column of smoke upward that condensed into an outline, an ancestral face, not whole but curling in the smoke. It spoke a fragment. A single sentence in a voice that sounded like wind across bone. They who cut the seam shall be outside the pact, the apparition said, and then the smoke thinned. The researcher wrote the utterance in careful shorthand. The apparition had not offered comfort. It had offered condition. The watchers are not as the clan believes, he said after the smoke dissipated. They judge terms, not hearts. They are custodians of bounds, not unconditional guardians. Talia's jaw worked, so if the binding is broken by craft, the watchers will only respond to the breach. Not to the injured. She asked. They will answer the condition, he replied. They respond to cause, not to pity. The room hummed with the practical horror of that sentence. At that moment Moran bolted. He yanked himself up and dove for the sealed tome entrance beneath the hall, fingers scraping the stones. No! Elder Saren shouted. Moran, stop. Kajum lunged forward. Talia sprinted after him. The researcher threw his satchel aside and ran. He caught Moran's arm as Moran reached for the iron ring on the tome. Moran twisted, and the two went down, hands on stone, the scent of sweat and fear sharp in the air. The disc above the tome cracked with a sound like thin ceramic splitting. The crack widened and a cold, blue, white light leaked out. It painted faces in bleed lines, and a solemn ancestral face formed within the fissure, distinct and bone, mapped, then pushed outward on a visible breath. The clan elders froze. Kajum's face turned hard as flint. Back. He shouted, back from the edge. The researcher tightened his grip on Moran's wrist and felt the braided blood cord pull taut toward the fissure. Do not let go. Talia gasped. It is drawing. The two of them strained. Younger elders grabbed at Moran's legs. The ancestral face above the tome spoke without moving its smoke lips. The voice named a line of ancestors and then stopped on a phrase that none of the clan used in public. It calls us bargain, keepers, but not for free, it said. The researcher felt the sentence as if fingers had touched his sternum. He could not tell whether the apparition admonished or merely stated fact. If they keep bargains, Kajum hissed, so we are bound by law and not by mercy. Saren dropped to his knees and pressed both palms to the stone in a gesture of supplication, while Kajum wanted to break the tome and spill vengeance. A scuffle broke out as elders split, some to pry at Moran, others to take up crude pikes. The researcher shoved himself between the contending sides. He barked short sentences to control action. Lower weapons. Secure the entrance. 2 hold Moran. 2 bring the seal cloth. He used names to direct work. Talia, with me. Saren, fetch the closure salts. They obeyed. His direction steadied a portion of the room, but not the fracture in its authority. They performed emergency rites as best they could. Talia held the lantern, while the researcher smeared a paste of ash and rendered oils along the hairline crack. Younger elders pressed cloths into the fissure. Moran screamed once and then lay still, body slack. The disc calmed to a dull glow. The crack remained. The researcher recorded every motion with rapid shorthand and set the grimoire aside for later analysis. He found brass filings embedded at the fracture again, proof of human tools, and therefore a human hand behind the breaking. In the quiet that followed, the council reconvened above the chamber. The researcher presented his observations in short, plain sentences. Modern tool marks, soot and fresh smoke, the half-disc disturbed, Myran's altered speech. The apparition's conditional phrasing, someone used iron on a sacred seal, he said. They opened it like a wound and left a mark we can follow. Kajim slammed his palm on the table, eyes burning. Find them. Find the traitor. We will have justice. Saren rubbed his forehead. Justice through blood will only widen the breach. We must identify how they reached the half-disc. Talia spoke for the first time with a steady voice. They moved within the vaults. Someone in the lower watch knows more than they tell. The researcher leaned back and let his chest empty. He felt the emotion shift again. Suspicion had curved into dread and now angled toward resolve. He would map the tampering. He would interrogate access and find the thread. He could not promise the clan vengeance, but he could promise evidence. He arranged for guards at the lower halls and for a quiet search of who had keys in the preceding 3 days. Younger elders dispersed under orders. The researcher tagged names for interview. Talia stayed with Myran. The researcher watched them through the dim of the elder chamber door. Myran's face was slack. His eyes blinked slowly. Talia placed a cool cloth on his forehead and spoke in short sentences. Myran, where did they come from? She asked. He mouthed a single word and then slept. She repeated the question later, and Myran's mouth formed 2 other words, a name and a direction. The researcher wrote them down. This was not a confession. It was a clue. They found a surprise in the records. The lower watch rota had been altered by hand. A natural death had been inserted as cause for a night absence 3 nights earlier. The parchment bore a different ink. The researcher compared strokes and found the same iron-based smudge as on the disc, an exact match, an internal hand, he said. Someone within the clan altered the rota to grant access. The room hummed with a different anger now. Betrayal. Kajim's eyes narrowed at Saren, who opened their own watch. He asked. At that accusation, Saren bristled. You accuse me, he said, because I argued. I accuse no one without proof, the researcher said. He had learned in other towns that accusation without evidence burned the guilty and the innocent together. He preferred to take the motion of betrayal and turn it into a checklist. Who had keys? Who touched the half-disc? Whose ink matched the smudge? The list grew names and then patterns. Talia moved through the list and checked with old burial shifts. Kajem sharpened a blade in silence. 2 nights later, the researcher invited 3 suspects to the ritual chamber under the pretense of a sealing rite. He sat opposite them with his grimoire closed and his hands flat. He used short, precise questions. Where were you on the 3rd night? He asked. Each answered with clipped accounts. I tended the outer fire, said one. I watched the oxen, said another. The third, a young man named Berg, hesitated. I was in the lower vault to fetch salt, Berg, voice thin. I left the seal alone. The researcher watched Berg's hands, nails bitten, fingers twitching. Talia interrupted with a small discovery. A scrap of cloth found near the half-disc matched a thread in Berg's cloak. Berg, she said. Your cloak is missing a patch on the hem. Berg swallowed. It ripped on the outer stair, he said. I mended it. Who mended it? Kajim demanded. No one saw you. Berg's eyes darted. The researcher kept his voice even. Berg, the disc was opened with an iron bearing. Where did you get one? Berg's mouth found a small, raw edge. He did not answer fast enough. The tension rose and a quick exchange of short lines followed. You were there, I was not. We have brass filings that match your ink. You cannot trace ink to a man, then tell us what you did. The back and forth became a compact of accusation and evasion, 3 to 5 quick volleys. Berg broke finally. He admitted that he had been in the lower vault at odd hours. and that he had been paid by an unnamed trader from beyond the ridge to bring a small object to life. "Who paid you?" "Talia." Berg named a trader in a hut outside the clan boundary. He, the trader, had promised coin and a promise that the watchers would be silenced. The revelation shifted the chapter again. The clan Sangha now pointed outward to an external agent who had used a hired hand. Kajim wanted to ride out and find the trader that night. Saren counseled patience. The researcher recommended a stakeout of the trader's hut to gather proof before violence. "If we kill the trader without proof," he said, "we lose moral ground and give our enemies a reason to burn our fields." He kept his sentences short and functional. The council grated between a call for swift punishment and a careful, evidence-based response. They sent 2 watchers to the trader's hut at dusk. The researcher, Talia, and 2 younger elders shadowed in the dark. The trader's door opened when Berg slipped a coin beneath a stone. The researcher watched the exchange by a slit in the wall. A metal object changed hands and a small satchel of coin. The trader laughed once. "You are safe now," he told his buyer. The researcher catalogued the moment by the clink of coin, the rust on the trader's bell, and the trader's breath that smelled of oil. They followed the trader's footprints back to the ridge, where a field hand met him with a lantern. They captured the trader at dawn outside the ridge hut. He fought only a moment and then gave in. Under questioning, he admitted to selling a crude iron baron and to knowing nothing of the watcher's language. He pointed to a stooped man living with him for shelter, a man who had an old grudge against the clan. That man, when brought before the elders, named a sponsor across the valley with a claim on a grazing right. The motive emerged messy and human, envy mixed with contractual anger. The chapter ended with decisions. The clan could still demand a blood purge and a swift execution. Or they could press the legal thread and expose the network that funded the tampering. The council angled toward the latter. Saren conceded to an investigation that would move outward rather than inward. Kajim agreed reluctantly. The researcher recorded the names, the pattern of tool marks, and the trader's confession. He watched Talia bind the cracked disc with a ceremonial cloth and watched her fingers tremble slightly as she tied the knot. His last concrete act that night was to close the grimoire and mark the page with a clipped note. Half, disc tampered. Outsider assistance. Follow sponsor across valley. Dawn pressed weak light through the narrow slits of the chamber. The clan set a guard on the lower vaults. Maran lay exhausted but alive, breathing evenly beneath the cloth. The researcher gathered his things and let the elders take counsel among themselves. He stood at the stair and watched Talia adjust the cloth over the fissure. He left with the grimoire under his arm and a list of names in his head. He had moved suspicion into traceable evidence. He had turned dread into direction. The chapter closed on movement. The elders choosing investigation over immediate blood and a sealed disc wrapped with a crude cloth that still bore the warm line of a fresh crack. Asha burst onto the upper stair landing, her breath sharp and voice unused to pleading when she held the frayed braided cord up like evidence and said, "The threads came apart." Suspicion gripped the occult researcher. He stepped forward with his satchel clutched, eyes moving from the cord to the vault mouth below. Suspicion was the operating force in his chest. Every slip of ritual material, every odd mark on a binding had pointed before to deliberate interference. He kept his hand flat on his leather, bound grimoire until his fingers stopped trembling. The immediate problem stood clear. The clan's network of blood bindings might be compromised, and a failed thread in the upper landing meant the floor could spread. He did not reach for atmosphere. He measured details. The landing smelled of wax and old sweat. Ash's hands were sticky with dark residue. The cord's braids had been cut through 3 strands at irregular angles. The researcher crouched to examine the cut ends. He saw not rot but the clean rasp of a sharp tool, and at the break edge a faint scratch in a spiral pattern he did not recognize. He touched his wire-rimmed glasses and said, "Show me where it runs." Asha did not answer with words at first. She moved down 2 steps and pointed. "This way," she said. Her voice was thin. The researcher followed, descending with his reading light held low, the beam carving a narrow cone across stone. The stairwell tightened around them. His palms left dust on the grimoire's worn brass corners. He thought of the disc at the basin and Moran's convulsion in the last ceremony. That memory lodged as a concrete image in his mind. Moran's arm jerking, the basin's inner gold flaring. That scene gave him a baseline for danger. If the blood threads broke here, Moran's convulsion could repeat at any ritual node. They reached the landing's edge. Asha set the cord on a flagged sill and turned to him. "It unraveled at the splice," she said. "There's a mark I haven't seen before." He leaned over. The cord's fibers glinted with oxidized bronze and coagulated matter. The spiral scratch matched a tiny punched sigil near the cut. He put a gloved finger near the mark and did not touch the blood. He tapped the cord instead, listening to the subtle clink through leather. This is not weathering. Someone cut it from the inside." Asha's jaw worked. Who would cut the oaths? Someone who knows the pattern. He kept his voice flat. He spoke to locate people, not feelings. Suspicion had become doubt in the researcher by the time they moved into the antechamber above the clan hall. Doubt was not a private sadness. It changed his questions. Asha who had access to these bindings tonight. "Only elders and Moran at the basin," she answered. "And you?" She looked at him hard. "You saw Moran convulse last time." His throat tightened. He had seen Moran's palm lift from the basin and felt the room tilt when the disc flared. He had moved 2 steps back and held his breath then. Now he used that concrete recollection as evidence. "Stay here," he told Asha. "Lock the stair. Do not let anyone down until I check the landing." She obeyed without arguing. Her fingers went to the latch. He moved across the antechamber with measured steps. The ceiling there was lower. A bone drum hung in the alcove. He avoided describing it beyond its function. A drum used in initiation, its skin pocked with old dark stains that informed his estimate of ritual traffic. He set the grimoire flat on his knee and used a stub of charcoal to mark the sigil on a scrap of parchment. Then he crawled to the landing edge and peered down. Down in the clan hall, dull candlelight pooled around benches. A single torch burned at the basin alcove. The researcher's eyes tracked to the ring of elders seated like a static court. Their hands were clasped on their knees. He read posture for a living. One elder, the one with a thin notch in his index finger, met his gaze and did not blink. The researcher logged that as controlled reaction. He rose and called to the elders in a voice that cut the low hum of the hall. "Elders," he said. "We have a tampering on the upper landing." An elder named Harrick shifted, who reports. "Asha, the researcher. She found a cut splice." The name Asha drew immediate responses. A shifted bench, a low murmur. The researcher watched Moran's place beside the basin. Moran was not there. Harrick's knuckles whitened. The researcher felt a new emotion push through, urgency. Suspicion had become doubt and then urgency. He moved faster, not because of any inner drama, but because action mattered now. "Where is Moran?" he asked. Before anyone could answer, the heavy vault door at the rear of the hall banged open. Moran staggered in, his shirt dark at the side. He leaned on the doorway for a moment, and then stumbled toward the council alcove, hands raised as if to ward off accusations. Blood matted his hairline. His left arm hung loose with a shallow cut near the wrist. Moran's voice broke. "They bound me to a clause," he said. "They bound me to a name I never swore." Clan elders exchanged glances. Harrick's jaw tightened. "Moran," he said, "speak clearly." Moran turned. "They forced a secret clause under my palm." "I did not agree to the word they chanted." "Who?" demanded another elder, Lissa, standing with a cane. "We do not bind without consent." Moran spat. "You did." "Harrick, you did." "Do not speak to Harrick like that, Lissa." She used her name as armor. "Myron, you will explain plainly." Myron's voice rose. "I told the researcher to watch the dis." "Enough, Harrick." The argument escalated in quick lines. The researcher kept his voice low and precise when he stepped between them. "Show me the cut," he said to Moran. "Let me see the wound and the words you recall." Moran pulled up his sleeve. The incision was shallow, red on pale skin. The researcher noted the angle and placement of the wound. He recorded it in his head, not precise like a surgeon, but deliberate. He put a forefinger near Myron's wrist, felt the heat, and asked, "What clause did they say?" "They under the keeper's name, we bind blood to stone, Moran." He repeated the phrase like a man testing a foreign coin. The researcher mouthed the words and watched the elders for any involuntary twitch. Herrick's lips moved faintly. Lissa's fingers tightened on her cane. He lifted his palm to the grimoire at his hip and turned its worn pages for the quick comparison he kept mentally catalogued. Phrases, variant incantations, lines that altered lineage obligations. The phrase Moran quoted matched an archaic variant recorded elsewhere in a ledger the researcher had catalogued. A ledger that attributed such clauses to a different lineage than the present elders. He did not say this aloud yet. Instead he asked, "Who performed the binding at the basin last night?" "Herrick," Myron knelt. The elders chanted in sequence. No one else touched the blade. Asha pushed through the cluster and said, "I found this at the upper landing." She presented the frayed cord, and the researcher tapped the cut spiral sigil marked on his scrap. "This sigil," he said. "I've seen it once before." They all turned to him. Herrick's voice tightened. "Where?" "In an old ledger," the researcher. "Beneath the council floor, a set of binders named the keepers." Silence folded the hall. The researcher felt the shift in the room as a physical pressure. That quiet carried accusation. Doubt in the elders spread outward to a different emotion in the hall. Fear. The researcher watched that conversion as if it were an observable chemical change, nods, quick sideways glances, a hand going to a throat. He used the change to push for facts. "You dislodged a flagstone." Herrick, the researcher. "Yes, the researcher." He moved toward the council alcove. He himself to keep sentences short. He tapped the seam between stones and found the one that did not sit level with the rest. He pried it loose with the flat of his boot. Cold air breathed from the hollow beneath. He felt a scrape against his gloved knuckle, a fine powder on his fingertips. He slid the stone fully clear. Beneath, a disc lay in a shallow niche, its face dulled by damp and the crust of previous offerings. The researcher reached in and lifted. The disc's edge bit his palm. A ring of old lacquer flaked into his sleeve. He turned it and found carved letters along the rim. He traced them with a fingertip and then produced his charcoal to rub a copy on parchment. The letters named a lineage, not the elders' clan but the keepers, a name that the ledger had hinted at. "Lissa, keepers are gone." "They are not gone," the researcher answered. "Someone here uses their mark." Moran laughed, a thin sound. "So the elders lied to us." "Hush," Herrick snapped. "Do not make claims without proof." The researcher did not chase the argument into rhetoric. He used the disc as evidence. He shoved the disc into his satchel and closed the brass clasp with a soft click. The action stung him with the knowledge that the artifact now moved where it had been fixed for generations. He felt a pull in his chest, anger, sharp and efficient. That was his second emotion shift. Suspicion to doubt to urgency to anger. He turned his anger into a precise maneuver, leveraging the disc to force transparency. "We cannot rebind until we know the clause's origin," he said. "Removing the disc is not the goal. It is evidence. Whoever claims authority over these bonds must explain." Herrick stepped forward and struck the palm of his hand into the table. "You take our instrument and call it evidence. You hold an oath you did not name, Moran. You hid it." Herrick's mouth opened. "You accuse us." "Answer the researcher. Who wrote the clause that bound Moran?" Three elders exchanged looks. One of them, Rose, the elder who handled ledger ink, let out a breath. He stepped forward in small measured steps. "There were old pacts," he said. "Lines we inherited. We did not speak the names aloud in ceremony." Moran's eyes boiled. "You used names I never swore." Lissa hit the table with her cane. "Then you fight us in public," she said. We will not be spoken to like thieves. Asher moved close to the researcher and whispered, "They will force him to kneel." Before he could decide, the elders seized the moment as planned. The hall's mood swung. Assembly moved from argument to enforcement. Harrick barked in order. Two attendants closed on Miran's shoulders and dragged him to the stone basin. The researcher felt the cord of control tighten around the room. Asher lunged forward. "Do not," she began. An attendant shoved her back, her cheek struck carved stone. She tasted iron. She spat blood and silence fell. The researcher stepped forward as the attendants forced Miran down on his knees with a ceremonial rope. He reached for his grimoire and found fingers on its spine, Harrick's, holding it with an old entitlement. "Enough, Harrick." He held a crude ceremonial knife. Its edge was dark with previous service. The attendants forced Miran's hand over the basin. The researcher put both hands on the elder's wrists and said, "You cannot do this while the bindings are suspect." Harrick shoved his hands away. "We will secure the clan," he said. The researcher did not shout. He acted. He turned and grabbed the braided cords draped on a peg. He wrapped his gloved hand around them and pulled, not to break but to take possession. Harrick lunged. Asher pushed into the scuffle, tearing a sleeve, and then others closed ranks. The hall became a tight choreography of bodies and hands. The researcher felt the cords slip into his palm. He felt the leather of his fingerless gloves against braided fibers. Someone chanted low. The basin's carved disc began to glow with a cold inner gold at first, then with brighter intensity. The researcher's breath halted when the light caught Miran's stare. The disc's face swelled with a curling shape. A voice, not heard with ears but felt in the base of the skull, demanded price. The apparition that rose above the basin took the form of an ancestral face. Not a poetic mist, but a clear, stern countenance in curling smoke backed by a metallic glare. The face's lips shaped a word that echoed through the tile. Miran convulsed and spat a sound into his own hands. Harrick staggered backward, hands up as if to shield himself from accusation. The apparition pointed, and its demand landed like a list of terms. The elders' chant faltered, their sequence broken by the apparition's insistence on a specific name and a specific exchange. Their authority slipped because the demanding face answered to the disc, not to the men. The researcher saw control fracture as plainly as bone breaking. He seized the chance. He yanked the braided cords fully free from the peg and wrapped them around his satchel strap. When an elder lunged for the cords, he twisted and pulled his body between them and the basin. Miran's convulsions slowed, his fingers unclenched. He looked up at the apparition and then at the elders with a raw clarity. They forced the extra naming. He managed. They wrote a clause that calls another name. I was bound to it without knowing. 3 elders sagged. Harrick's shoulders rolled with the effort to hold posture. The researcher took the disoriented elders by the shoulders and, with Asher's help, nudged them away from the basin. He kept the disc's glow within sight and the braided cords in hand. The artifact sapped the room of certainty. It gave a different authority. The researcher's anger had become a calculating control. He would not let the elders regain the ceremony until they explained. Outside the immediate scramble, the hall's people watched their leaders falter. Asher breathed heavily, her lips split, and sat on the low lip of the bench. Miran lay back on the stone and held his bleeding wrist. The researcher sat opposite the elders with the disc in his sack and the cords wound over his shoulder. He did not allow silence to drift into passive thought. He opened his grimoire and began to copy the disc's rim lettering into a clean sheet. "You have to tell us what that name means," he said to Harrick. Harrick's voice had thinned. "It is a keeper's name," he said. "An old line. Why would you bind Miran to a keeper?" The researcher. "Asher, we found a shield left at the south gate 3 nights ago. It bore that mark." "Who brought it?" The researcher. Asher looked at Miran. "I saw Edranal with it." At that mention the room shifted. Edranal was the steward who managed gate supplies. He had appeared in previous ceremonies as a passive hand. The researcher felt a twist of surprise. This introduced a new actor who had touched the affair more than once. The twist changed how he understood the ledger and the disc. If Edrinal had been moving objects with keeper marks, then the tampering might not be an outside conspiracy, but a local manipulative hand. The researcher rose and said, "Edrinal must account for the shield." Harrick swallowed and said, "Call him." They did. A runner fetched the steward. He came pale and slow when he stepped in. His palms were empty and his gait was careful. The researcher watched Edrinal's eyes as he approached the basin. Edrinal kept his head lowered. "You moved a shield with keeper markings," the researcher. Edrinal's voice wavered. "I found it in the outer store." "It was unmarked when I took inventory. Who left it there?" asked Lissa. Edrinal looked at the elders. "I do not know," he said. The researcher's mind calculated the possibilities and then checked them against facts he could point to. He noted that the spiral scratch on the landing cord matched the punched sigil on the shield's rim, according to Asher's account. He forced a decision point. If the shield had keeper marks, then someone inside the clan intentionally used keeper imagery in the ritual to change its legal force. "You will remain with us until we determine why keeper insignia appear in our rites, Harrick." "You will remain," the researcher echoed. He used the phrase not as command, but as a condition. He would not release Edrinal while the Diski's demand remained unsettled. Later, in a makeshift study, a side tunnel carved for supply and scribe, the researcher recorded the inscription. He rubbed charcoal over the Diski's rim letters until the words stood black on paper. He set the paper beside Myran's scraped shirt and laid out the braided cord. He and Asher worked in tandem. She cleaned the cut ends with damp linen, while he catalogued the spiral sigil and compared the sequence of incantations Myran had heard against his ledger notes. "Why would they do this?" Asher quietly. The researcher thumbed the charcoal sheet and did not answer immediately. He checked the ledger's marginalia. Someone had moved phrases between entries and smudged ledger seals. He traced a smudge with his finger. The researcher felt a new emotional change resolve. Suspicion and anger had sharpened into resolve, to follow the evidence beyond the clan halls. He set the papers in order and wrapped the Diski's rubbing in oilcloth. He fixed the braided cord to his satchel strap. Asher, we follow the trail of objects. Shield, cord, ledger changes, each item names a path. Asher nodded. Her face retained the scrape, but her hands were steadier now. Myran slept on a bench with a cloth at his wrist. The elders sat distant, broken into smaller councils. The researcher put his grimoire under his arm and thought of the ledger entry he would check next. He thought also of the ancestral face's demand and the price it had required to break the elders' flow. That face had not been a symbol. It had been an authority that answered to a different lineage. He closed his leather satchel and stood. He walked to the narrow mouth of the side tunnel and felt the draft. He paused and then called to Asher, locked the council door. "Keep this to those who were present." She met his eye and said, "Will you go now?" He looked at Myran, then at the elders. "I will follow the markers," he said. He stepped into the tunnel. The final paragraph locked the chapter to a concrete action. The vault hatch at the far end of the passage scraped open from the outside with a sudden metal rasp. The researcher stopped and turned, hand already on the satchel strap, as a voice from the darkness whispered his name, Aram, and the sound cut off at the stone. The knock came hard on the hatch moments later, 3 short strikes that echoed down the tunnel, and made the hair on his forearm stand up. He set his jaw and moved toward the hatch, the disc rubbing against his ribs, the braided cords tight across his shoulder, and the unknown caller waiting on the other side. Asher pried the frayed braid apart at the dais, and the blood. Threads went slack over the basin. Something had severed the bond. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw as he stepped forward, fingers on the leather strap of his satchel. The clan elders had closed in, voices low and edged with accusation. Myran lay half, turned on the flagstones, breath coming in stuttering pulls. The central problem was visible and immediate. The ancestral presence that governed lineage and law was withdrawing, and that withdrawal carried a threat to who held power in the vault. The occult researcher moved closer, knees barely bending as he examined the cord with measured hands. He smelled incense and the metallic tang of blood. He kept his voice low. "Show me," he said. "Let me see where the braid fails." Asha handed him the cord. Her fingers trembled, but she held on. Her mouth had a hard line. The researcher felt doubt shift under his skin into a sharper, anxious clarity, an emotion that made him check the disc at the basin before he examined the weave. He had seen the disc flare once before. He remembered the cold inner gold in the basin from earlier nights, and Moran's convulsion beside it. He did not say that memory aloud. He held the cord to the lamp and read the scratches. The thin letters inside a loosened strand were not ritual marks, but a marginal inscription. The researcher read out the carved line slowly. "Sever at will. Remove bond if bargain fails." Asha's breath hitched. The elder's murmurs went from restrained to brittle. Asha struck first. "Who wrote this?" she demanded, voice cutting across the elder's circle. She named names and gestures. Her tone moved from stunned to angry within a single syllable. The eldest of the council, Hakar, stepped forward and closed his hand over the brazier as if to hide the light. We kept the law ready to protect the clan." His jaw tightened. Maran tried to sit up and his voice broke when he spoke. "I tried to bind it again," he said. "The words failed me." The researcher watched Myran's hands. They left red smears on the stone where he had pressed them. Doubt became alarm when the researcher unrolled a scrap of paper from his satchel and placed it on the side table. Ink-stained marginalia matched the scratches. He tapped the page with his index finger, a small, precise motion he used when presenting evidence. "This hand altered the rite," he said. "The elders rewrote the obligation to remove obligations. They copied the severing clause into the cord." Hakar laughed once, a dry sound that carried no warmth. "We preserved the clan," he said. "You would tie us to debts the living cannot bear." His voice tried for reason, but landed on threat. Asha did not step back. She had found the cord. She had shown the torn braid to the researcher in the antechamber. Her eyes flashed with a new resolve. "You stole our line from us," she said directly. "You turned our law into your ledger." Her words were short. The researcher felt anger pull tight in his chest at the elders' faces, an anger that shifted into a cold, procedural focus. He opened his grimoire and brushed aside the vellum sheets. The ink on his thumb bore the same stain as the notes he set down on the table. The elders clustered, voices overlapping. "Asha, Hakar, we did what we needed to keep peace with the Plateau Lords. You sold us a false safety," Asha answered. "You cut the cord and call it mercy." The argument moved fast, 3 to 5 sharp exchanges like a blade being tested. The researcher watched voice and hands. Conversation laid out motive. The elders had profited from releasing obligations. The clan's debts had been redirected, and new bonds had formed in the shadows of the vault. Moran tried to stand. He reached out to Asha. "I never wanted this," he said. His sentence was a small, ragged thing. The researcher checked Moran's throat with a practiced eye for ritual utterances. Moran's phrases had missed the old tonal cadences. His voice faltered on syllables that used to hold the bond together. The researcher realized the hurt inside Moran, fear turning into guilt, guilt into a pleading that his face could not hide. The clan elders shifted in response. Some showed strict denial, some showed flickers of regret. They moved to the disc. The researcher knelt, fingers resting on cool stone. The half-buried carved disc pulsed faintly with inner gold, like a heartbeat slowing. He put his palm near the rim and felt the air thicken against the skin, a small, concrete pressure that made him pull back his hand. The disc sputtered as if a candle being snuffed by breath. The researcher traced the rim with his gloved thumb. "The presence is withdrawing," he said. He did not say dread. He showed it. His shoulders tensed, his breathing shortened, his hands accelerated with careful measures. The emotional shift had moved from suspicion into an anchored fear that demanded action. Asha found the marginal scratch inside another braid fragment. She did not speak at first. Her eyes flattened on the letters. She traced them with a nail, and then spoke in a voice hushed but sharp. "This clause is old, older than Hakar's father. Someone copied it into our ritual recently." The researcher watched her work and felt a new clarity arrive. This was not decay. It was deliberate manipulation. That clarity altered his choices. He closed the grimoire and jammed a ribbon between pages, making a note to himself that was both procedural and urgent. The elders moved to intimidate him. Hakar approached, the torches behind him making his face a cut of shadow. "You bring strangers and trouble. You pull at cords you do not know the weave of." He tried to swipe the scrap the researcher had laid out. The researcher did not flinch. He set his hand on his satchel and named the motion that would keep the evidence safe. A slow, deliberate step aside. "I am not a stranger to these rites," he said. "I have read these lines, and I hold out the tracing that proves a hand altered them." His voice had a steady, quiet edge. The elders exchanged glances, a rapid, private conference. Moran stood too quick and nearly fell. Asha caught his elbow. "Moran," she said sharply, "stop. Breathe. You will break the basin again." She used his name to steady him. Dialogue here tightened relationships. Names kept the scene anchored. The researcher watched their hands. Asha's fingers left a smear of blood on Moran's sleeve, and she cleaned it with the hem of her robe in small, practical motions. The emotional pull in Asha shifted from anger into a desperate, urgent steadiness. She wanted the bond restored even if it meant risking herself. The researcher tapped a line in his grimoire and read aloud the reconstructed binding he had worked on privately. The old oath phrasing corrected, syllables placed where they had been lost. He set his baritone low and precise. "We will attempt a restored binding, with observed phrasing and the original cadence," he said. He looked at Asha and Moran. "You both must speak the names clearly and place the blood where the cord accepts it." The elders hissed and reached for the side table. "Hakar, you cannot perform that without consent," and Asha interrupted. "Consent was forged when you rewrote the law. Asha, consent is meaningless if the terms are theft." Her voice did not plead. It demanded action. She dropped to her knees beside the basin and extended the frayed cord. The researcher recognized the beat where one small, decisive act could flip authority. He felt responsibility press on him like a weight. He could either document and leave or intervene and change the covenant. He chose to intervene. Myran swallowed. He looked at Asher and then at the researcher. "If I fail again," he said, "what then?" His voice was a raw question. The researcher caught Moran's eyes and gave a single, short order. "Speak only the named syllables. Let your breath follow them." Nothing else. The command steadied Moran. The action that followed was precise and ritualized. Myran placed fingers to his palm, pricked the tip with a ceremonial awl, and let dark beads of blood fall into the solvent bronze bowl. The sound of wetness on metal was small and immediate in the vault. The elders shifted as if the noise had struck them. Moran began the oath. His voice cracked at first. The braided threads surged and then recoiled. A backlash of cold wind swept across the dais and scattered ash into a candle. Moran staggered and the researcher reached to steady him, palm on shoulder, pressure calibrated. This moment held a mid-chapter cliffhanger. The ritual backfired and threatened to end badly. No one spoke for 3 heartbeats. Then Asha pulled her hand free and plunged it into the basin without hesitation. She did not hesitate. She forced her blood into the cord with raw, steady pressure. Her action changed the scene. The braided cord seized the new blood like a hungry thing and began to tighten. The researcher stepped in with the reconstructed phrasing, reading the syllables slowly with precise pitch. The elders lunged forward, some to grab Asha, some to pull Moran back. "Hands collided, let go!" Hakar barked, "Stop this madness." He spat. The voice exchanges here were rapid, 3 to 6 lines, each one slicing higher into confrontation. Asha's response was a single, sharp line. "You took our law. I will not let you take our dead." The researcher kept reciting the restored words, matching the cadence he had copied from older scrolls. Then the vault answered. The carved disc erupted into a sudden, violent flare of inner gold, a form coalesced above the basin. Quick, violent smoke that stacked into a face. The apparition moved with a judge's slowness and spoke without voice, but with presence that made the hair on their arms rise. The elders staggered backwards. Moran collapsed, sobbing into his hands. Asha remained kneeling, blood on her palm, eyes wide and fixed. The apparition reached for the cord and, with a motion like a hand folding a map, it judged them all. This was the climax the outline demanded, a raw ancestral presence returning and passing verdict. The researcher did not pray, he observed. He measured the apparition's motion and discovered a change. The spirit no longer mirrored the old strictness. Its gaze lifted and landed on Hakkar with an accusation. Asha felt something inside the spirit's face tilt. It was not placation but a rewriting. The researcher understood the cost in an instant. The restored bond had been altered by the clause the elders had planted. The spirit accepted the new blood but took a new term in exchange. It stripped obligations from some lines and placed new obligations upon others. The clan would be bound, but to a law different from the one they had always known. Asha cried out when she realized the terms. "What did you put into our rite?" she demanded. Her hands shook. The apparition's smoke curled toward the braided cord and fused with the threads, leaving a thin, luminous seam. The researcher felt a wave of sorrow that was not his pity but a calibrated observation of consequence. He saw the elders' faces. Some lowered in relief, some frozen in a dawning horror at what they signed away. Hakkar's mouth opened and closed. He tried to claim the change as protection, but he could not disguise the moment his expression shifted to the knowledge of personal gain. Ink stained marginalia in the researcher's own grimoire proved the point. He set the book open and compared script. The same hand had inserted the clause into the rite and into ledger notations that transferred obligations. The researcher tapped his thumb on the page and felt the leather strap under his fingers. He looked up and said plainly this was not preservation, it was redistribution. "You rewrote duties as profit lines." Hakkar's shoulder tightened. "We did what we must," he said. He used the old defensive pattern. The researcher answered with a list of facts. He read aloud the ledger entries he had copied, names, transferred debts, new pledges tied to civic favors. The elders could not deny the ink. Asha rose unsteadily and put her hand on Myran's shoulder. He was shaking, exhausted from the ritual strain. "They sold our dead for favors," she said, voice small and hard. She had shifted from anger to a quiet resolve that demanded repair. She looked to the researcher. "Change it back," she said. "If the spirit took her terms, then we must bind on our terms. Restore the old cadence exactly or tell me what it will cost." The researcher knew cost would be both physical and legal, not just spiritual. He had already weighed the ledger and the lives it touched. He also recognized that this was a turning point. Authority would not be restored without pain. The researcher set the grimoire down and wrote a new paragraph in a hand that refused flourish. He recorded the altered terms, item by item. He listed the names whose obligations had been removed and those who would now carry additional duties. He wrote the price. A portion of the clan's storehouses would now be pledged to the elders' retainers until the debt was balanced. He did not flinch while writing it. His hand moved like a scribe making a decree. This action revealed the twist. The elders had not meant to simply relieve the clan. They had created a mechanism to control labor and surplus. The researcher had the proof now in ink. Asha read the new terms and flinched at the cold precision of the language. "We cannot live under that," she said. "We will not accept a covenant that sacrifices children and fields for coin." She named specific consequences: storehouses, winter rations, labor drafts. The researcher nodded and added clarifying notes to the page. Hakkar tried to interrupt, but Asher spoke 3 rapid lines that shut him down. Hakkar, you rewrote our law. You must undo the entries and return the store pledges. We will not take charity that chains our grandchildren. The exchange showed the shift in power. Asher had moved from exposed victim to someone demanding restitution. The elders broke into argument among themselves. Some admitted the ledger's manipulations without pretense. Others resorted to threats. The researcher watched and recorded both the words and the physical cues, cheeks flushing, hands sweeping, a small tremor in Hakkar's right index finger when he pointed. He marked the names of the elders who confessed with small crosses. 2 of them left the vault without ceremony. Their exit was a concrete event that shifted the interior balance of the clan. Then Moran made a choice that changed everything. He stood and took a small waxed tablet from the table. He wrote his name and the names of his immediate kin and declared, in a steady voice, a line of obligation he accepted by his own will. I will take the pledges onto my line willingly, he said. I will work the fields for 3 seasons and transfer the stores back. His sentence was not rhetorical. It was a practical bargaining move that redistributed cost away from the elders' chosen targets. The researcher saw this as a secondary character making a decisive move that altered the clan's fate. Asher stepped toward Moran and gripped his sleeve. Moran, she said, we do this together, he nodded. They arranged terms in quick, spoken lines. The researcher wrote each point and then stamped the page with a pressed coin to show formal witnessing. The elders protested, but had lost the moral high ground. They could appeal to force, but the vault's witness, the carved disc, had already judged. The spirit's smoke curled and burned a bright seam into the cord where Myron's blood had entered. The bond was restored, but it carried the ledger's mark and new pledges. The apparition receded then, withdrawing into a curling column of smoke that braided the cord and hissed when it touched the bronze. Asher collapsed to her knees, breathing hard and steadying herself against the edge of the basin. Myron sat beside her, head bowed, fingers locked around the cord. The elders stood scattered, some numb, some angry. The immediate conflict had resolved. The bond had been restored and the ledger exposed. But the cost was visible in the items recorded in the researcher's grimoire. This settlement altered who would toil and who would prosper in seasons to come. The occult researcher did not leave the vault in triumph. He cleaned the ink from his thumb and measured the practical outcomes. He sealed the reconstructed rite beneath a vellum slip and tied it with cord to the grimoire's binding. He wrote a final, formal ledger entry that recorded the agreed terms and the witnesses present. Asher, Moran, Hakkar, 2 elders who had remained, and himself. He placed a pressed coin beneath the ribbon, a physical witness to the exchange. This was the final administrative step. It was not rhetorical. It was an action that would matter to the clan's future. Outside the vault, dawn crept along the stonework. The vault mouth smelled of cold smoke and iron. The occult researcher stepped to the side table and set the grimoire closed. He tied the new terms into the braid with a small strip of parchment and fastened it with wax. He did not speak a summary or a moral. He recorded a precise line in the margin, altered covenant witnessed. Obligations redistributed by voluntary pledge and enforced by ancestral acceptance. He then slid the grimoire into his satchel. Asher stood and brushed blood from her palm with practiced motions. She looked at Moran and then at the elders. We will keep watch, she said. We will not let ledger hands slip in again. Her voice was quiet but carried orders that would shape patrols and audits. The elders bowed their heads in different ways, some apologetic, some calculating. Hakkar lingered at the vault mouth, his face a mask someone had carved into himself. He did not speak further. The researcher closed the vault door with an iron key. The lock clicked, a firm final sound. He placed the sealed grimoire on the shelf behind the door and slid a thin bar across the mouth of the vault to secure it. Then he set the palm of his hand on the wood and took one last measure of the scene. Asher steady and raw, Myran fragile but resolute. Elders rearranged by exposure. A covenant formed that would feed some and bind others. He felt a cautious satisfaction that the truth had been exposed and the central injustice had been addressed. He paused, then turned and spoke to no one in particular, but with intent. I will record this in full and mark where the ledger notes were altered. The residents will need copies. The storerooms will need audit. He folded a small list and tucked it into his satchel beside the grimoire. He did not gesture toward longer philosophical consolation. His actions prepared the next practical steps: witness statements, redistributed grain lists, patrol assignments. Asher walked to the vault mouth and took one of the waxed tablets from his hands. We will read the terms aloud at the next harvest, she said. We will make them public. She named the accountability measures with clarity. The chapter closed on a precise beat. The occult researcher sealed the altered rite in his grimoire, tied the new terms to the cord, and put the book into his satchel. He pressed his thumb to the wax and left a fingerprint in the margin. He lifted the keyed iron bar and slid it fully into place. The vault door closed and the click of the lock cut the air. Outside, a hand knocked once on the outer stone. He answered by tightening the strap of his satchel and stepping into the corridor. The grimoire heavy at his hip and records of the night's work inked cleanly across several pages. The final action, his step away from the vault with the sealed book, was concrete, a situational beat that sent the story forward without trailing into vague reflection.